it is time. We're going to go ahead and get started. Thanks everybody for being here, spending some time with us today. This is the Disability and Healthy Relationships Echo session, our May 2026 session. If you want to, you can put your name and you don't need to put a bunch of contact info in the chat. I actually would love it if you put your name and just tell us who you are, maybe your organization that you're joining us from, so we can kind of get to know who's in the session with us today. We are recording the session, so just keep that in mind. We hope that you will stick around with us. But we record it so that we can share this session on our website and in like a Canvas course also, so that more and more people can learn with us. So thanks for being here. Echo is an interactive community. We partner with everybody that comes here together so that we can all learn together. We want to hear from you. We want to hear any like questions that you have as we're going along. We have discussion time at the end that we hope that everybody will join in and share their thoughts and their ideas and questions and anything so that we can learn from each other. So keep that in mind too. We're happy you're here. Please protect privacy if you're sharing, cases that you've worked with or even like experiences or people that have gone through things, whatever. Just protect their privacy, please. So as we start the session, we are going to have a speaker, our presenter first, and then we'll have some community questions time after the fact. And we love to hear from you in the chat throughout. So if you have comments or resources that you want to share, anything like that, please feel free let's have an active chat. We love the engagement. We do ask though that you keep muted until it's time for speaking. So through the presentation, if you want to be engaged, unless we ask you to unmute, just stay muted and then we'll be able to hear our presenter. If you want to, we would love it if you rename your profile to have your name and like your location where you're joining us from and maybe your organization. But also if you put that in the chat, that is a heads up for us as well. But you can do either or both. Also, if you want to raise your hand to ask a question, we're open to that. So this tells you how to do that. I think most of us have probably used Zoom enough that we know how to do that. But just in case you need to know, here is a little bit of that. Today we are going to have just like a discussion with some questions that we've put together. But an important part of Echo is actually sharing case studies. And we would love if anybody on the call has like a real life situation that you've either dealt with or that you are dealing with, something that you would like to discuss with the group, reach out to me and we would love to maybe have you tell us about it in our next meeting so that we can have some dedicated time to talk about that with you as a group. Okay, so today's topic is abuse prevention, signs, and reporting. And our presenter is Erin Meottel. Did I get that right? Yes. I was nervous about how to say her last name, Erin Meottel. So she is the prevention coordinator at Peace House, a nonprofit dedicated to ending interpersonal violence and abuse in our communities. With over 5 years of specialized experience, Erin designs and implements violence prevention strategies tailored for individuals of all ages and abilities. Erin's work is rooted in the belief that through education and primary prevention, we can create safer futures for everyone. In her spare time, you can find Erin watching sports, playing soccer, or spending time with her dog Miles and her partner Camden. So with that, we are so excited to have you all here with us. And like I said, if you have comments or questions, please put those in the chat. We'll be watching those. And I'm going to stop sharing so that Erin can jump in. The time is yours. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Mindy. Can everyone see my screen? Perfect. So, as Mindy mentioned, my name is Erin Meottel. I am the prevention coordinator at a Utah-based nonprofit. We are called Peace House, and we are dedicated to ending interpersonal violence and abuse through intervention strategies like safe housing and supportive services. But we have also, over the last few years, really developed a robust prevention program focused on primary prevention tactics to ending abuse in our communities. And a big part of my role at Peace House actually does focus on the intersection of interpersonal violence and youth and adults with disabilities. So today we will be focusing on different types of abuse throughout the lifespan, starting with child abuse all the way through elder abuse. We will talk about some warning signs of abuse. And then universal prevention strategies and reporting tips as well. I know we are on Zoom, so I usually give these presentations in person and always tell someone that if you are feeling overwhelmed or triggered by anything I'm talking about, you are welcome to leave the session or leave the room. These are really hard topics, and I always say I'm one of the presenters that will never get mad at someone leaving their presentation because I understand that these can be really, really hard things to talk about. So I really thank you all for being here. I saw in the chat someone's from Los Angeles, which is my hometown. So it's really cool that we have people from all over here today, and we are going to dive right in. So, I kind of wanted to start off by talking about the prevalence of abuse, right? Why we are focusing so much on prevention work and these strategies. And that is because 70% of people with a disability will experience some form of abuse in their lifetime. So, that can range from child abuse to domestic violence to that elder abuse. And this data is pretty consistent, showing that it is a really, really high rate of violence against this population. It is one of the highest among marginalized communities. And in terms of underreporting, about 70 to 85% of cases actually go unreported when we're talking about violence and abuse. And in general, that can be for a variety of different reasons. But when you are looking at it in the context of disability or someone having a disability, there are additional barriers as to why someone might not report abuse or harm happening. And that can be that the perpetrator is their caretaker, someone that they rely on every single day for their basic support needs. It could be that certain organizations that provide the resources aren't as accessible as maybe they should be. And so we notice that there are lots of barriers putting in place that might prevent someone from reporting. And we want to reduce those as much as possible. And then, like I mentioned, this statistic is for all types of abuse, but we see high rates of violence across any kind of identity, any sort of type of abuse. And we'll talk about that a little bit later. We've broken it down by the type of abuse and the rate of violence that we see. But we also want to mention that for this population, it is about 97 to 99% of victims know their perpetrator, okay, which can also be a barrier. Like I said, it could be a caretaker, it could be someone in the family, but we are seeing in almost every act of abuse against someone with an intellectual or developmental disability, that perpetrator is someone that they know, could be a family member, someone close to them. And so, lots of different reasons why we want to be talking about prevention, why we want to be acknowledging the barriers that exist and trying to do primary prevention efforts to reduce the rate of violence that we're seeing. And so we are going to start by talking about child abuse. Okay, so that is typically the first type of abuse that we're going to mention because it is for victims anyone under the age of 18. So it starts, the day that someone is born and goes until they turn 18. And it's important to remember as we are going through these slides about child abuse that the perpetrator could be anyone of any age. When we typically think of child abuse, people almost always assume an adult perpetrator. However, it could actually be a teenager or another child that is this same child's age, because actually 50% of child sexual abuse is perpetrated by another child. And so we really want to make sure that we are keeping an eye out for lots of different types of violence that can be happening. We are believing children when they're coming forward. And once again, showing the need for having these conversations that are age appropriate at any age, especially as young as, preschool, even younger. And so when we are talking about child abuse, okay, by definition, this is the non-accidental harm of a child, the threatened harm of a child, sexual exploitation, sexual abuse, neglect of a child, or human trafficking of a child by another person. So pretty lengthy definition there, but I really like this definition because it encompasses all of the different harms or acts of abuse or violence that can happen against children. And obviously, as you can see, the non-accidental piece is underlined because that is the key component. Okay, the act of child abuse is not an accident. We always like to clarify, it's not someone bumping into a child and knocking them over. This is deliberately trying to cause harm to them. And there are many different ways that someone can do this. And then one thing we always like to point out when we're talking about human trafficking, so whether that's labor or sex trafficking, that is one of the ones where if someone is older than 18 and is experiencing human trafficking, the presence of force, fraud, or coercion makes it human trafficking. Now, when we're talking about youth that are experiencing any sort of human trafficking, there does not need to be the presence of force, fraud, or coercion. Just the act of trafficking a minor automatically falls under that definition. And so that's one thing we like to highlight because some people do get confused there, but if there's any sort of exchange of, labor, if there's any sort of commercial sex act happening that involves a minor, there does not need to be force, fraud, or coercion present for it to be human trafficking. Okay, and then just some statistics. So, overall, children with disabilities are more than twice as likely to experience violence compared to those without disabilities. And there was a fascinating study that was done, and I'm happy to send it to Mindy afterwards so it can be linked. But there was a global study done about the prevalence of child abuse for youth with disabilities. And the estimate was nearly 1 in 3 children with disabilities have experienced some form of violence. So, right off the bat, right, our first type of abuse that we're talking about, we are seeing those with disabilities being disproportionately affected by this type of violence. And so now we're going to go into the types of child abuse. So on the last slide, we talked about a lot of different examples, and they tend to fall into these different categories. Okay, we have physical, emotional, sexual, and neglect. So with physical, this is any action that results in or intends some sort of physical harm or injury to a child. And some examples of this can include things like hitting or kicking, slapping. But when we're talking about a child with a disability, it could include tampering with, removing, or restricting any access to their assistive technology. It can be taking batteries out of an electric wheelchair. It can be damaging communication devices. Could be misadministering medication. So either over medicating someone or under medicating someone. And that's a theme that you'll notice throughout all of the types of abuse that we'll talk about, but especially for children. If there's an adult that manages their medication, definitely can be a sign of physical abuse. Okay, any sort of intentionally withholding necessary therapies or even access to that medication or healthcare can fall under physical abuse. Okay, and then after that, we have emotional. So, this is any sort of harm to a child's self-worth or their well-being. Okay, and so this can include calling the child hurtful names, belittling them. It can look like threatening a child or yelling at a child to the point where they feel afraid. It can also be mocking the child, maybe humiliating them in front of other people, maybe labeling them as a burden to the family because of their disability. Okay, it can be blaming the child for any problems that the family has or any extra care that they require. It can be threatening abandonment, threatening to withhold medical care or to send the child away. All of that can fall under that emotional abuse. And then we have sexual. So when we talk about sexual abuse, we break it down into two different categories. We call them contact and non-contact. So when we're talking about contact sexual child abuse, this is someone trying to make any sort of contact with the private parts of a child's body or trying to get a child to make any sort of contact with the private parts of their body. And then that non-contact would be showing a child pictures or videos of people without their clothes on. This could be taking pictures of a child without their clothes on. This could be forcing a child to undress in front of them, things like that. And that's actually the way we recommend describing it to youth. That is the way that can very easily distinguish the difference between contact and non-contact and highlights that non-contact sexual abuse can exist, right? There are lots of different studies, articles, information out there of non-contact child sexual abuse happening that is still not okay, that children still need to learn about. Okay, and then our last one is neglect. So with neglect, when we are talking about the basic needs of a child, right, they have four basic needs: food, clothing, water, and shelter. And if someone is intentionally withholding or intentionally denying a child access to any of those basic needs, that is what we would call neglect. Okay, and the intention here is very important. We get asked all the time, like, what if a family member, is lower income and is struggling to provide those resources for that family? And that's a great question. And we always try to share, like I said, the importance of intent and letting them know that if someone maybe has lack of resources, but is trying, they're like reaching out to the school, they're reaching out to community members, trying to get access to like a local food bank or things like that, that would not fall under neglect. It really is if someone is intentionally denying or withholding someone access to those basic needs. And that can also include important medications, communication devices. It could be withholding medical care or lack of access to proper educational needs, like lack of access to special education if someone needs that, right? Things like that. Also, lack of good hygiene. It could be unsafe living conditions, things like that. Okay, and so now we are moving on to our next type of abuse, which is teen dating violence.
Erin,
So,
before you go on, I'm just going to remind everybody to stay muted. Thank
thanks,
you.
Janelle. Appreciate it. So I think this one is so important to talk about because it's so commonly overlooked, right? We talk so much about child abuse, we talk a lot about domestic violence, and teens can really easily be forgotten about. But we are seeing such high rates of teen dating violence happening. I work in Summit and Wasatch counties, and we are seeing such an increase in teens reaching out to utilize services, to make reports, which is what we want, right? We want teens connecting to resources and we know it's happening. And so we really want them connecting to resources, but we want to make sure we are including them in our prevention efforts. So when we are talking about teen dating violence, primarily we are talking about ages 12 to 18. It could go, up to 19 as well, but we're talking about teens. We're typically seeing these behaviors happen in the preteen age, starting at age 12, and then going up into adulthood at age 18. And this includes any physical, psychological, or sexual abuse. It can include harassment or stalking of any person ages 12 to 18 in the context specifically of a past or present romantic or consensual relationship. Okay, so just breaking that down a little bit, we have the stalking piece, which is very, very crucial to identify because teens now are using technology as a method to stalk someone. They are downplaying the efforts that really fall under the term of stalking because they're kind of minimizing it as normal behavior. And I'm getting a little ahead of myself, so I'll talk about this more on the next slide. But we want to talk about specifically for teens, it is in the context of a past or present dating relationship. Okay, and then youth with disabilities between the ages of 12 and 19 do experience physical violence, including physical abuse, rape, and sexual assault from a stranger or partner, almost 6 times more likely than youth without a disability. So, more data showing that this population is experiencing higher rates of violence, specifically in the context of their dating relationships. And so, as mentioned, right, we kind of categorize the different types of teen dating violence into these five categories. Similar to child abuse, you will notice that physical abuse, okay, so that is any sort of hitting, kicking, any sort of hurting a partner, the way a partner communicates, their communication methods, things like that. Then we have the psychological. So this is when we'll start to see power and control. So abusive relationships solely revolve around one person trying to gain power and control over another. And these are all the methods that they do that. And it is a form of psychological abuse to demonstrate those controlling behaviors. Specifically with teenagers, we see a lot of threatening self-harm or suicide. We see a lot of frequently displaying or acting on jealousy. And we give presentations to teenagers and we tell them the feeling of jealousy is normal. Many people experience that. That's okay. But you cannot use that feeling to control what someone else does. You cannot feel jealous and then tell your partner, like, hey, you can't talk to this person or you can't follow them on social media. We actually just did a focus group at our local high school, and so many teenagers said it's very normal to expect to look through someone's phone. And that one can be a combination of that psychological and digital abuse. So a lot of these can overlap, but those are the main trends that we're seeing among teenagers right now. And kind of jumping over to sexual, this can include any sort of unwanted touching, any rape or attempted rape, sexual threats or harassment. The biggest one that we're seeing among teenagers is sextortion. So this is essentially asking someone for explicit photos, and once those photos are received, using those photos to then blackmail someone. So using those photos to say, if you don't send me more photos, I'm going to send these photos to all of your friends or your family. Or if you do not send me money, I'm going to send these photos to your family or your friends. And this one is a really big concern that we are looking out for. A nationwide organization called the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children reported a 300% increase over a 2-year span of reports of sextortion that they were seeing. So it is something that is happening very frequently. It can happen from a former dating partner, from a friend, from someone at school, but this one can also happen from a stranger, right? We are having people reach out to teenagers over social media platforms, over video games. And the big concern with this, right, other than just the huge concern in general with it happening, is this can happen so much quicker than the standard grooming process, right? When you think of a typical grooming process, that could take days, months, or weeks to occur. We are seeing sextortion happen in as little as an hour from initial contact. So it's definitely something to be aware of. We'll talk about some signs to look out for and some prevention strategies later, but I really like to highlight that one because we are seeing such high rates of suicide from teenagers because they feel trapped. They feel that they're going to get in trouble, that they have done something wrong, and this person who is sextorting them is, frequently demanding so many things that they cannot fulfill, and they feel there's no escape. So we really, really want to highlight that one now more than ever. And it also ties into digital abuse. So with this one, this is using any sort of technology to control, to isolate someone, to frighten them, right? It can be using psychological or emotional abuse tactics just over technology. And so it can be, harmful communication, right? Threatening someone, belittling them, putting them down, sending that in a text message or leaving a voicemail. This can be, like I said, it could be looking through someone's phone or forcing someone to share passwords. It can also be location sharing. So we tell teenagers, like, hey, if you want to share your locations with your friends, that is fine, but it should be consensual and someone should not be taking advantage of that. So if someone is now using your location to monitor where you're going, if they are checking in on you by saying, like, hey, you said you were going here, why aren't you there? Things like that can fall under that digital abuse. And then our last one, like I said, is stalking. So we hear all the time from teenagers like, oh, I stalked them on the internet, or I'm, internet stalking them. And we try to explain to them the importance of using that language in the correct context because it does happen. It is a really, really common thing that teens don't realize is happening to them until we give them that language. And essentially, it is, a pattern of behavior that makes someone feel fearful, right, or afraid for their safety. And it can happen a few different ways, right? It can be any sort of surveillance. So, like watching someone, like I said, there could be that intersection with tracking their location. It can be life invasion. It can be showing up where this person is supposed to be. It can be sending them excessive gifts, right? Things like that. Any sort of behavior that would make a reasonable person fear for their safety. Okay, and now we are going to talk about domestic and sexual violence. And so the reason that this one is starred is because, we couldn't really put an age on it. So we typically think of domestic and sexual violence in the context of adults. However, there is domestic violence related child abuse. That is the most common type of child abuse that we see in the state of Utah, which is domestic violence in the presence of a child. Right? There can also be sexual violence at any of these ages. And so while it does kind of go with our timeline, there is a lot of overlap with these, right? You could have a teenager that is witnessing domestic violence in their household. Okay, you could have a child experiencing that sexual abuse like we talked about. So just keep that in mind. That is why there's a star and there's no age on this one, but that is something that we wanted to mention. And so, by definition, we consider domestic violence a pattern of abusive behaviors in any relationship that is used by one partner to gain or maintain power and control over another person. So, we hear a lot of the time a lot of misconceptions about abuse, where people are mentioning that abuse happens because someone is really angry or because they have a substance use problem. Okay. And those things can absolutely contribute to violence, but the sole reason is someone wants to gain power and control over another person. And like I mentioned before, they can do that through physical, sexual, emotional, economic, psychological, or technological actions, or even just the threat of actions, or any patterns of coercive behavior that would influence another person. Okay, and data is showing us that people with disabilities experience domestic violence at 5 times the rate of those without disabilities, and individuals with disabilities are 3 times more likely to be sexually assaulted than their peers. Okay, and very similar. So you'll notice here there is a lot of consistency through these different types, but each one kind of has their own, right? So the teen dating violence had stalking, domestic violence, we see a lot of that financial abuse. So I'll talk about that one a little bit later, but very similar for that physical and emotional, right? It could be physically harming someone, it could be threatening to physically harm someone. With that emotional abuse, it could be telling someone things like, you won't survive without me, right? If it's a caretaker or if it's a partner who does help caretake for this individual. It could be telling someone that no one else will love you because of your disability, or I'm the only one that could ever love you, right? Harmful communication like that. Very similar with that sexual abuse. We get this misconception a lot. People don't understand that sexual assault still can happen, even in marriages, in long-term relationships. Okay, there still needs to be that consent, no matter how long the relationship has existed, no matter the type of relationship, if it's just a dating relationship, if you're engaged or married, there still needs to be that mutual agreement of consent. Same thing, we have that digital abuse and then financial. So, financial abuse is actually one of the most common types of abuse that we see in abusive relationships. So, it takes place in 99% of abusive relationships. And when people ask us, like, well, why doesn't someone just leave their abusive situation? We could talk to them for hours about that, but financial abuse is one of the most common reasons that we explain to someone, right? Because put yourself in that situation of you're in a relationship and someone has restricted your access to finances, right? That's the bottom line of financial abuse. It is a form of power and control over someone else's finances. So using those finances to control or isolate someone else. And so if you put yourself in that situation, you're in this relationship and you're trying to leave, but you have no access to a bank account, and you have no cash, you have no access to credit cards, right? You have no way to pay for any of the things that you might need. And then you add on the other layers of maybe having a pet or maybe having children involved in the situation. Okay. And that really, really can be a hard thing for people to navigate. And so, one of the first things that we recommend to someone who is experiencing abuse or is looking to leave their relationship is to start saving any sort of cash that they can in a safe and private place so that they can have something, right? All of our services at Peace House are free. You will find that at a lot of other domestic violence and sexual violence organizations because of financial abuse, right? Because a perpetrator might have ran up a lot of debt on someone's credit cards. They might have gotten their partner fired from their job. So this person doesn't have any way to provide for themselves. Or someone might be receiving disability funding from the state. Someone might be taking advantage of that, right? Not giving someone access to their own money, changing passwords on bank accounts. So many different ways that financial abuse can look and is a really, really strong method of power and control over another person. Okay, and then we're at our last type of abuse, which is elder abuse. So, with this one, we are specifically talking about ages 65 and older. Okay, and it's really important to keep this in mind because we are all mandatory reporters, and I'll go over this later, but elder abuse and elders, so anyone who is a vulnerable or elder adult falls under that mandatory reporting guideline. And it's still important to be doing prevention work with our elders because we want to make sure that they know the signs of abuse, they know what elder abuse can look like, and we can help prevent them from experiencing it or connecting them to resources if that is something that they are experiencing. Okay, and so this is any intentional or negligent act by any person that causes harm or a serious risk of harm to an older adult. And around 1 in 6 people, 60 years and older, experience some form of abuse in a community setting during the last year. And approximately 1 in 24 cases of elder abuse is actually reported to the authorities. So, as I mentioned at the very beginning, we see a really low rate of reporting when it comes to any sort of abuse, but especially elder abuse. Okay, especially when we're talking about people who might be isolated in their home, who might have a caretaker, who might have health problems. They might not feel like they know the resources that are available or have access to connect to resources. And so, once again, very similar, right? They might experience physical abuse, but in a different form. It could be like physically restraining someone. It could be, once again, over or under medicating someone, especially if someone else, like a caretaker, is managing this person's medications. It could be emotional abuse, similar to what we talked about, right? No one cares about you. You rely on me. I am the sole purpose. I'm the one that you need to be looking up to. I make all the decisions in this relationship. Sexual abuse, specifically in the caretaker setting or in like the nursing home setting, we see a lot. And then for elder abuse, we see a lot of neglect or abandonment, right? So this could be medical neglect. This could be any sort of lack of basic needs as well. So unsafe living conditions. This could be noticing signs of like dehydration or malnourishment when it comes to elders or abandonment, right? Isolation, not properly caretaking for someone else who needs someone else to be there to help them in different settings. And then financial abuse is also the fastest growing crime against elders that we are seeing. And so this can be taking advantage of someone's finances. This can be draining their bank accounts. This can be, we see a lot of scams, unfortunately, with this community. And so being able to recognize like how are they noticing any sort of theft of possessions? Okay, it could be forcing someone to withdraw funds from their accounts, any sort of financial neglect, things like that. And so now we're going to kind of dive into our warning signs. So now that you're aware of what all of these things could look like, we are going to talk about signs to look out for. And I want to preface this by saying that these signs do not mean 100% that someone is experiencing abuse or neglect. However, they are signs that we should be paying attention to if we are noticing them repeatedly happening, right? We're noticing a pattern of these behaviors, or if we are noticing multiple of these behaviors happening at the same time. Okay. And so we're starting with children and teens. So, some things that we notice in this age group if they are experiencing abuse or harm. And there are lots of signs. These are the ones that we notice the most often. And these are the ones that we really, really want to pay attention to. And notice how a lot of these boxes start with the word sudden, right? Sudden or unexplained or unusual, right? That's what the kind of the bottom line of this. We want to be looking out for any significant change in behavior, okay, that happened suddenly. Right, that is unexplained, that is unusual for this person. Okay, and so for example, sudden fear of a person, like other adults, like a partner or a caregiver, or a specific place. So if your child loves going to school, they love going to the park, things like that, and now all of a sudden they are fearful of that, we want to pay attention to that. We want to recognize, why are they now afraid of other adults? Why are they now not responding well to their caretaker? And that can be difficult at times, right? Because like I said, a lot of people say, well, kids have behavior changes all the time. But like I said, it is unusual for a child to suddenly display a significant fear of a place or a person, and we want to pay attention to that. Okay, any sort of dehydration, poor hygiene or grooming, any chronic hunger, any sort of hoarding resources. Okay, so if they're at school and you notice they're hoarding snacks or food at lunch, could be a sign that this person is experiencing neglect. Okay, any sudden or unexplained personality or performance changes. So, like I said, kids can change all the time, but we want to notice if maybe you're a teacher and you have a student who is a star student. They love school, they're always on time, and now you've noticed that they have no interest in school. They do not want to participate. They really have done like a 180 in their behaviors. And maybe it's because they are experiencing abuse from someone at school. Or maybe you have a child who was not engaged in school at all, and now they come to school because that's their safe place, because they are experiencing abuse somewhere else. And so you're noticing these personality and performance changes, or any sort of sudden or unusual interest in or knowledge of sexual matters. So, keeping in mind the age appropriate content and topics that students typically know. Okay, if you have a child who is suddenly very interested in sexual matters, if you have a child that is showing other children different sexual matters, whether that's photos or videos, if they all of a sudden have knowledge of these things, definitely important to take a look at, right? If that's something that they're experiencing, if that's something that they're witnessing from their friends or their friends are telling them about, and at that point, we definitely want to intervene. Changes in sleep patterns or difficulty sleeping, any sort of unexplained or repeated injuries, any sort of lack of necessary aids. So if you notice a child doesn't have their wheelchair or their communication device, their glasses, their hearing aids are broken, right? If you're noticing these things, that's something we want to keep in mind as a sign of physical abuse. It could be a sign of neglect, right? Of their basic needs not being met. Okay, and then sudden refusal to go to school or any other favorite activities. So if your child loves Special Olympics and all of a sudden they have a refusal to go, they don't want to be a part of this anymore, we want to keep in mind why that might be happening. And that's something we always challenge any teacher, caregiver to look into, is instead of rushing right to that judgment, right, of like, oh no, this kid is now acting out and they have a personality change and are really being difficult in this class, we want to ask why, right? What could have happened to them to cause this personality change? And maybe it is, they are just being a little bit more difficult now than they used to be. They are, causing more distractions in class. They are things like that. But we always want to lead with the empathy and the what could be happening and how can I maybe ask the question or look into this situation. And then for our adults and elder adults, so similar to, we have some overlapping ones here, like the unexplained or repeated injuries. So if you're noticing someone is describing an injury in a way that maybe doesn't match with how they could have gotten that injury, if you're noticing repeated injuries that are in various stages of healing, if you're noticing a lot of bruising, a lot of different types of injuries, cuts, scrapes on these people, like I said, just a time to check in. Okay, improper medication management, over or under medicating someone, any sort of broken, damaged, or missing aids like hearing aids and wheelchairs. For the financial abuse, whether that's for an adult or an elder adult, any sudden, unexplained bank withdrawals, missing funds, or altered legal documents. If you're noticing verbal abuse and humiliation in front of others, so if you are around these individuals, if you're around their partner and you're noticing that they're belittling them, they're putting them down, they're humiliating them in front of you, okay, it could be a really great thing to check in with that person. Because if someone feels comfortable doing it in front of other people, there might be more happening behind the scenes at home that we could check in on. If you're noticing someone is frequently or excessively monitoring someone else's behavior, so if you're out with a friend or hanging out with a friend and they feel like they are constantly having to check in with their partner, or if the plans change and they are really panicking and trying to figure out, okay, this person's going to be upset with me, right? They feel like they have to always give an explanation or give a reason to their partner, right? That is something that could be a sign of that digital or that stalking behaviors. Okay, unusually fearful, submissive, or avoidant of specific caregivers. Any sort of caregiver limiting access to friends, family, a telephone, or other social contact, right? That could be that sign that they are trying to isolate that individual. They are trying to limit their access to the people that they care about. And then our last one is unsafe living conditions, right? So any sort of conditions that have poor hygiene, any sort of things that are dangerous. And especially that one could also apply to children and teens as well. Okay, and so now we're going to talk about prevention strategies. And something I love about prevention is it is universal, right? All of those different types of abuse that we talked about all can fall under these different prevention strategies, right? These can be applicable to all of the things that we just talked about. And when we're talking about prevention, right, it is essentially a systematic process that promotes healthy environments and behaviors and reduces the likelihood or frequency of violence occurring, right, in this context. Prevention as a whole can be utilized in many different respective categories like substance use, but in this context, we're talking about violence and abuse. And really, it's a proactive strategy that is designed to stop a problem or another social issue from occurring. And violence is a huge public health issue, and it is preventable through different strategies. Okay, and kind of the prevention continuum that you'll hear a lot of preventionists talk about is primary, secondary, and tertiary prevention, are kind of those three main prevention strategies. And primary prevention is an approach that takes place before violence has occurred to prevent initial perpetration or victimization. So essentially, this is an upstream approach that is tailored to all populations. Okay. And it can include things like violence prevention campaigns, it can be education, right? It is kind of giving those skills and those tools to prevent the violence from ever happening. And this is really what we are trying to do. This is our work at Peace House. This is what we really focus on our prevention team. Like I said, it is that going upstream, and that's one of the most effective ways to prevent violence from happening. Then we have our secondary. So this is an immediate response after violence has occurred to either deal with the short-term consequences, but to also intervene from violence and to try to prevent violence from occurring again. So the goal with secondary prevention is to address specific instances of violence and to try to prevent it from happening again or from escalating. And this can include things like offering resources or offering services, right? For example, we have an emergency helpline and a shelter at Peace House. And that shelter is a great example of a secondary prevention tactic because it is an immediate response. It is an emergency shelter that someone can stay in for up to 30 days, and it gives them a safe place away from the perpetrator, right? To try to prevent that violence from happening again or from escalating. Okay, it can also include training. So this can be training service providers. For example, it could be training law enforcement on tools like the lethality assessment. I'm not sure how many people are familiar with this, but it's called the LAP. It's the lethality assessment protocol. And it is essentially a tool. There's about 12 questions on it. And it determines someone's likelihood of lethality. And it is actually now mandated in the state of Utah for police officers to give this when they respond to a call of domestic violence. And so they are essentially asking the question that after an act of violence has already happened, but they are still trying to prevent lethality. So if someone has scored high lethality, they try to refer them to a place like Peace House immediately. Okay, and so that is a secondary prevention tool. And then our last one is tertiary. So tertiary are actions that focus on addressing the long-term consequences of violence from ever occurring in the first place, right? So we kind of consider this the treatment, while secondary is more intervention and prevention, primary is education. Okay, and tertiary can include things like programs that help victims and survivors obtain education or employment. It can include ongoing advocacy and programming. It can also include like services for perpetrators. Okay, and essentially a comprehensive response to abuse does involve all three of these types of prevention. And we as a culture typically focus on secondary and tertiary a lot. A lot of our time, our money, and our resources is focused on these two types of prevention. But more recently, there is kind of increased awareness about the effectiveness and importance of the primary prevention tactics. But like I said, all three of these are crucial to preventing violence as a whole. And so the two tactics that I'm about to share with you are essentially primary prevention tactics. And the first one being reducing risk factors and increasing protective environments. So, this is kind of the foundation for so much prevention work. You'll hear people across all platforms talking about reducing risk factors and increasing protective environments. And essentially, when we're talking about reducing risk factors, a risk factor is a characteristic that may increase the likelihood of someone experiencing an adverse childhood experience, like violence. And a protective factor is any characteristic that may decrease the likelihood of someone experiencing an adverse childhood experience, like violence. And preventing youth violence requires understanding reducing risk factors and increasing protective environments. And these can exist across multiple spheres of influence, from the individual level all the way to the societal level. And on this slide are the risk factors at each level. And so the biological, right, for individual, that's any like biological factor or personal history, like someone having a disability, someone's income level, someone's substance use, their history of abuse, if they've experienced or witnessed abuse in the past, or any sort of previous exposure to any sort of traumatic event or any injury. Relationship looks like your close circle of friends or family members or a partner, or it's really anyone who can influence your behavior in your close circle. And the risk factors for this level include like high conflict, poor communication, you notice power and control imbalances, any sort of financial strain, isolation, weapon access is a really big one. Then we have community. So the economic, social, and environmental conditions within a specific community. So this can look like if there's limited opportunities, like limited education or job or economic opportunities. It can be low levels of community engagement. There are lots of different community organizations that try to increase protective factors by putting on events, offering classes. But if we see like low levels of community engagement in those kind of extracurricular activities, that can be a community risk factor. If there are high rates of local crime and violence or inadequate access to basic services, right? If you think about it, if a community has inadequate access to basic services, a child's likelihood of experiencing neglect for their basic needs does increase because they might not have an accessible grocery store. They might not have those basic needs that children kind of need to have to thrive. So that's an example of how they kind of play into each other. And then with societal, we have our large scale structural or cultural conditions. So, public policies are a huge potential risk factor, right? Economic systems. For violence specifically, harmful cultural norms is one of the biggest ones, right? We all have heard many people make jokes about violence. We have all heard people maybe minimize or deny that violence is happening, right? If people are maybe living in a society or a culture that kind of promotes victim blaming, that can be a really harmful risk factor. Okay. And it can also be any sort of discrimination and marginalization of specific groups can be a societal risk factor. And so on this slide are the protective factors or the protective environment. So these are the things that we want to increase, right? On the last slide, those are what we want to see decreased as a society, right? A lot of you are involved in different avenues. You might be a medical professional, you might be a soccer coach. All of us can contribute to one of these levels of prevention strategies for our protective environments. And so, for the individual level, this is promoting attitudes, beliefs, and behaviors that prevent violence, right? This can be conflict resolution and life skills training. It can be social emotional learning, safe dating, and healthy relationship skills programming. So, providing this education is huge for someone at the individual level to adjust their attitudes and beliefs about violence as a whole. Then at the relationship level, this can include any sort of parenting or family-focused prevention programming, right? Giving parents the skills to increase their conflict resolution, their communication skills, because that sphere of influence affects a child. Okay? It could be mentoring programs. We have some great mentoring programs in Park City that we've seen such high success rates for increasing the protective factors, right? Having that mentor that you can go to is a great way to reduce that risk of violence and abuse. Any sort of promotion of positive peer norms, problem solving skills, and promoting healthy relationships at the community level, right? Improving the physical and social environment in these settings, creating safe places where people live, where they learn, where they work, and where children can play. Okay, addressing other conditions that can give rise to violence in communities. So, neighborhood poverty, residential segregation, and instability, high density of alcohol outlets. Okay, there's a lot of overlap. There's a lot of shared risk and protective factors for substance use and for violence. Okay, so you see high density of alcohol outlets. Okay, if we can improve the social environment or this physical environment, that can also kind of reduce the rates of substance use and violence that we're seeing. And then at our societal level, any sort of promotional of norms that protect against violence, right? So encouraging people to have these conversations, stepping in when someone does make harmful comments about violence, right? Creating policies and practices that promote safety and healthy relationships. Okay, and then also strengthening efforts to have financial security, education opportunities, employment opportunities, and other policies that really affect the structural determinants of health. Okay, and then the second prevention strategy, this one I will shout from the rooftops anywhere that I can. Okay, accessible education for all age groups. Okay? Education is such an important prevention strategy that we all could be implementing, right? This does not have to be all of us developing an amazing curriculum that is prevention focused. It is as simple as having a conversation, right? So, like I said, this is specific because every single age group and every single different subset of the population can receive prevention programming. It is so flexible to everyone, which is what I love about it, like I said earlier. So, one of the most effective ones is that child-focused programming, right? Children are one of the most effective groups to do primary prevention work with. And this can start so young, okay? Because there are age-appropriate ways to bring up these conversations. That is such a big question that we get is like, how can I talk about abuse with my 3-year-old? And we try to tell people you don't have to, right? You don't have to bring up abuse to them. You can teach them something as simple as you can say no, right? If aunt or uncle so and so are trying to give you a hug, and you can tell them no if you don't want a hug. That's a prevention strategy. And you're not even mentioning abuse if that's something that people are concerned about. Okay. And We also want to make sure that we are editing the way that we're talking about it with these children as they get older, right? We shouldn't be talking to our high schooler about something like that. At that age, they can learn more about healthy, unhealthy, and abusive relationships. Okay, and so supporting your local organizations that provide this education, encouraging it in your children's schools, or even just having the conversation, right? If you work in healthcare, you can ask the questions, right? At a child's checkup, you can bring up this conversation. You can look into books and resources so that we are just allowing this conversation to thrive because we know that violence continues to happen when we are silent about it, when we do not want to have the conversation. And like I said at the beginning, this is a hard thing to talk about, but we can make it easier on ourselves by making it fun, by making it age appropriate, and by reaching out to the experts, by asking for their advice. A lot of local organizations have resources. Like we just created a conversation starter kit for parents because we had so many parents saying, how do I even ask my kids about this? So we actually came up with a list of about 15 to 20 questions that they could just bring up at the dinner table or while their children are doing homework. So, moving on from children with parents, caregivers, and other trusted adults. So, education on being a trusted adult or your role as a mandatory reporter, recognizing the signs of child abuse, and being an informed resource are so important because kids are getting their information from social media, from their friends, and we want to be the source that they come to, that we can talk about this information with them. So we need to be willing to open up our minds to these conversations as well, right? How can I become a better professional? How can I learn more about this? Because in Utah, all of us above the age of 18 are mandatory reporters for anyone under the age of 18, for a vulnerable adult, which is an adult with an intellectual or developmental disability, and for elder adults. So if you just suspect that anyone in those populations are experiencing abuse, you have to report that to law enforcement or to DCFS. So, engaging with these resources, learning about how you can be a trusted adult for these groups is a really great way to become more educated about these topics. And then also for professionals in disability spaces, the same thing, right? Like I've said before, if you're a teacher, if you work in healthcare, how can we make sure that we are bringing up these conversations, right? How can we make sure that we know the signs where if someone is coming to us as their soccer coach, as their track coach, how can we say, you know what, I feel comfortable navigating this conversation or connecting this child or this person to resources? And then focus on teaching abuse prevention skills, empowerment, and building safety networks. So, kind of combining these two prevention strategies, right? Accessible education is about empowering the child. It is about, or whoever is receiving the education, right? We do a lot of work with children at Peace House, which is why that's where my mind always goes. But teaching empowerment so that people feel like their voice matters and that they can say no and that they have resources that they can be connected to. Also, like we talked about with our risk and protective factors, building those safety networks. Who are these safe spaces and these safe people that anyone can reach out to when they might need support? And so our last thing is reporting, right? If anything I have said today resonates with you as a self advocate or with you as a professional or a caregiver, here are a few things that we recommend when going about reporting, right? Like I said, we are trying to encourage people to report when they are ready. We never want to force anyone into reporting, but we want to make sure people are receiving the care and support that they deserve if they have experienced abuse or harm. So, as a self advocate, so if you yourself are a survivor, okay, remember that it's not your fault. This is a really common emotional abuse tactic is putting the blame on the victim. So, it is not your fault. You did not do anything to deserve the abuse that happened to you. Okay, nothing you could have done should have warranted or had that abuse happen to you. So, always remember that. Share with a trusted person when you are ready. So we always think it's helpful to give people some things to say, right? Because a lot of people say, I don't know how to even tell someone this. So you can be as specific or vague as you would like, but you could tell someone something like, hey, I have a serious problem and I need your help with it. Or I have something that has been happening to me for a really long time and I want to talk to you about it. Or I have been hurt by this person, or I have been abused by this person. Okay, giving them that language to come forward and describe what has happened to them. Make sure when you do this, you are in a quiet and a safe place where you feel comfortable so that you can get through as much of your story as you would like to with this other person. Okay, and then connect to local resources. So there are so many resources, like I said, that are usually free and available to provide follow-up services, whether that's case management, legal advocacy, therapy services. A lot of services, like us at Peace House, the abuse could have happened a few years ago, but you could still qualify for our therapy services, or even if you're a secondary survivor. So if you are the parent of someone who has experienced abuse, you might be eligible to receive therapy services from an organization like ours. And then practice self-care as needed, right? Go through this process at your own pace. Remember, like I said, that it's not your fault, and do what you need to do to take care of yourself throughout this process. And then for our professionals, our caregivers, our family members. So one of our favorite acronyms is TALK. We did not develop this. This is by RAIN, which is the Rape, Abuse, and Incest National Network. So you can look it up on their website afterwards if you would like to, but it is to thank them for telling you. So if someone comes to you and discloses, remember that it was probably a really hard thing for them to do. And then ask them open-ended questions. So we do not ever want to lead the conversation. We do not ever want to say something like, oh, so you're saying this person hit you. We would like to say things like, can you tell me more about that? Or then what happened, right? Can you describe that to me, right? Things like that that allow this person to open up. We want to listen without judgment. So, a lot of teens and youth specifically tell me that they have never told their story to anyone, or specifically like a family member or a parent, because they felt like they did something wrong and that they were going to get in trouble. So, one of my biggest pieces of advice, if you are a trusted adult to someone, is to make them feel comfortable sharing things with you and let them know that if it involves abuse or harm, that you are always a resource for them and that they will not get in trouble if they come to you with those things because youth need an outlet for this. They need someone to talk to. Okay, and then the K stands for keep supporting. So if this is a friend and you go get coffee with your friend every Tuesday, keep inviting them to do that, right? They might decline because they are going through a really hard time, but knowing that you are trying to keep a sense of normalcy for them and still be a support for them is huge. Okay, and then, like I've said many times, your mandatory reporting responsibility. I know we have people in other states here. I apologize. I only know the requirement for Utah, but if you do not know yours, this could be a great time to look up what your mandatory reporting laws are for your state specifically. Okay, very same thing for self-advocates, connecting to local resources, and then safety planning. So I did a presentation on this last year, but safety planning is a practical tool to decrease the risk of future harm for people who are actively in danger or who are experiencing abuse or neglect. And basically, it just asks this person questions about how they can stay safe in different environments around the perpetrator. So if the perpetrator is at their school, how can you stay safe at school? Are there counselors that you could talk to about the situation? Are there friends that you could walk with in the hallways to make sure that you don't run into the perpetrator? And I'm happy to include some resources for that as well. But that would be a great plan to make with someone, right? How can we keep you safe, or how can we help you safely leave this situation? So, if you ever need anything from me, this is all of our contact information for Peace House. That is my work extension and my work email. Please reach out to me if you have any questions or if you're interested in learning more about what we do at Peace House, if you're Utah based or even if you're not Utah based. But that is our website and our social media as well. But thank you all so much. You all being here is the first step in prevention and educating yourself. So, I really appreciate you all listening and coming to our echo sessions. So, thank you.
Erin, amazing. Thank you so much for all that information. I feel empowered. I don't know about the rest of you on the call, but I feel like I want to go out and just like do something in the community, some prevention strategies in my community and help spread the word to everyone around me. Thank you so much for that. Before we jump into our discussion time, I just wanted to see we're pretty much out of time for our presentation, but just quickly, if anybody has questions for Erin, um, right now, throw them in the chat. Um, and then I also, while you're doing that, if anybody has any questions for her, I wanted to bring to your awareness that survey that's been posted in the chat a couple of times. Some people, we're not done with our meeting, but if people start jumping off, I want to just remind you, please take that survey and tell us about your experience and give us any feedback that you have. We love that. And we need that for our project. So please, please. Okay. I'm not seeing any questions coming in. So, um, I don't want to move too fast if anybody's like quickly typing something, but if we need to come back to that, we can. But we do have some community questions that are related to Erin's topic today that we wanted to have some time to discuss with all of you. So, um, yeah, let's jump over to that. Janelle, are you prepared to break us up into our
Yep, as soon as you give me the go ahead.
groups? Okay, I think so everybody will just be put into a group automatically, and then you'll have one of our team members in there to facilitate and share those questions with you. Let's see. I guess I'll share them right now really quick. Okay. Okay. I'll share more next time.
Yeah, no, thank you though.
Okay, Mindy, everybody is back.
Yeah, I agree. We needed more time than that. We needed a longer breakout session today. We just kind of had some issues with it, but thanks everybody for participating. I'll quickly share what we chatted about and then I'll give the other group a chance to share. We didn't get very far though. We talked mostly about question number one and a little bit about question number two. But the experiences that people in our group have had with providing this education, I missed the first little bit, Alex. Sorry. So if you want to jump in and share, if there's anything, I know that I missed the first part. But we had one person talk about the Arizona USAID partnership with Special Olympics, and they had a curriculum that was for trainers working with youth athletes that they kind of adapted and have been using kind of on a trial run with a group of adults over 8 weeks. And that was touching on boundaries, consent, biology, healthy relationships, sexual decision making. Really cool topic and really cool partnership, I think, with Special Olympics. So thank you for sharing that, Selena. And then another program that was doing fetal alcohol syndrome education out of Alaska. Michael, thank you for nodding your head. I couldn't remember who was talking about that. Michael. And that was another really cool bunch of trainings that sounds like they were doing, talking about like fetal alcohol syndrome and what is like normal behaviors and how to address some of the behaviors they were seeing for like teachers and families that maybe just needed to understand more about that the disability and the developmental age that those kids were actually at. And then also like appropriate touch for the kids to understand and like public versus private behaviors and things like that for the kids specifically. And then for number two, the barriers, mostly just not being included and parents not wanting this necessarily from anyone but themselves for their kids or for the people they're caregiving for. So
Yeah,
that
and then
Alex, go ahead.
we were starting to hear from Lizzie, and then we got yanked out. And this is one of those situations where it's really great that we have so much participation and we could use more time to chat about these things. So if anyone didn't get a chance to share, we would welcome you to email us. We can share these discussion questions out with all of the participants who registered today, and you can provide written feedback so we can include those in our notes to send out to everybody.
Yeah. So the other group, Matt or Erin, do you want to share a little bit about what you guys talked about too?
Sure. Yeah, I can do that. We did introductions and found that we had an eminently qualified group with a lot of background and experience and a broadly national group. But some similar things, parents and getting parents engaged was something that came up, and it sounds like that's a common issue across multiple states. We also talked about just that a lot of this training is not happening within schools or other settings, and that continues to be a barrier. The interesting thing that we ended up with, that Libby in our group brought up, was diagnostic overshadowing, and that many people, adults with disabilities, are coming in to adult services or into right providers, mental health professionals, whatever, having already been abused or assaulted. And so they're bringing that trauma with them, and Libby brought up the fact that diagnostic overshadowing happens in those cases, right, where symptoms of that abuse, neglect, trauma might be attributed to their disability, right? It's just autism, it's just their Down syndrome, it's just and not the actual um, abuse and neglect that may have occurred. And we were just starting to dig into that because I've thought about that in mental health, but I haven't thought about it as much in this area. And so it's interesting that that came up. So Leo is helping take notes. Did I forget anything, Leo?
No, I honestly, I think you did a pretty good summary of what we talked about. Just a lot of, I mean, we just mostly talked about the barriers and how maybe there's
Yeah,
a lot of policy as well that goes into it and how different states experience that. So, yeah.
yeah, yeah.
Well, thank you so much, everybody, for participating. I can't believe how quickly our time has flown today. I love how many people we've had on the call today, and what all we were able to share and connect with each other. Thank you again to Erin for her presentation. So good, so empowering. I don't know, I still just feel like I want to go out and shout from the rooftop some of the things that you talked about, Erin. So thank you so much. And thank you, everybody, for being here. I hope you will join us again next month. We have sexuality and ableism coming up as our next topic. I will be sending out a little bit more information about that in the next couple of days, probably with some follow-ups from this meeting as well. So thank you all for being here. It was great. Hope to see you again soon.
Yes, thank you, everyone. And if you'd like to get more involved with us, please reach out to Mindy or I. You could join our planning team, or if you have ideas about a presentation, we welcome that as well. And then also in the chat, Katie put information about the AUCD SIG group on sexuality and disability on May
Oh, yes.
19th.
Thank you.
So just pointing that out for everyone. And thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you. Have a great day.